Welcome to Echoes of Ihsan. We're doing a deep dive today. We're going to be looking at Sahih Muslim, specifically Book 9, which deals with divorce.
Yeah. Book 9 is fascinating. It's a real mix. Legal rulings, social insights, and ethical stuff. All based on what the Prophet Muhammad taught and what his companions went through.
Oh, absolutely. One thing that really struck me as we got into these hadiths is how they use, real stories, like Abdullah ibn Umar and his wife keep coming up.
Abdullah ibn Umar, son of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, his story, the way it's in those hadiths, it's like a case study. You see Islamic principles in action, like how they actually worked in marriages and divorces.
It's kind of like a warning too, right? Like, be careful, think things through, and stick to the rules
Yeah.
when you're dealing with marriage stuff.
And that story connects to one of the big themes in Book 9. It's the rule against divorce during a woman's period. You see it over and over, often tied to what Abdullah ibn Umar did.
So, just to be clear for everyone listening, these hadiths are saying divorcing a woman while she's on her period doesn't count. They're still married. The divorce, it's like it never happened.
It's like Islamic law gets it. It understands that during her period, a woman is sensitive, physically and emotionally, and the law wants to protect her. Make sure nobody takes advantage during that time.
Yeah, it's creating a safe space. Right. So this massive decision, divorce, isn't made when things are, I don't know, rushed or when someone might be feeling vulnerable.
And it's not just about protecting the woman, there's also a practical side. This rule keeps the woman's menstrual cycle separate from the waiting period, the iddah.
I'm sure you're all familiar with the basics, but let's break down iddah for a sec.
Yeah.
It's the time a woman waits after a divorce or if her husband passes away. So,
Exactly. And that waiting time has a few purposes. It's a time to think, to adjust, practically and emotionally. But a big reason is to be sure if she's pregnant or not.
right, you got to know who the father is, especially if a baby's born after the divorce or death. It prevents problems down the road.
Exactly. And no divorce during her period. Well, that makes sure those two times, the cycle and the iddah, don't get mixed up. No confusion about the baby's father, no waiting longer than necessary.
It's amazing, right? These rules that seem so simple, they're actually dealing with all this complex stuff.
Yeah.
It shows you how deep Islamic law is, how much it thinks ahead.
Thinking ahead, paying attention to details, that's all over Book 9. Like how the ruling on saying I divorce you 3 times all at once changed.
Oh yeah, triple talaq. So it sounds like at first saying I divorce you 3 times in one go
Mhm.
was like one divorce, and you could take it back. Like, maybe you were just mad and didn't really mean it.
Yeah, early on, the hadiths show it was seen that way. One divorce, not final, you could go back to being married.
But then it sounds like that caused some problems. People weren't taking it seriously enough.
Yeah, during the time of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, Abdullah ibn Umar's dad, it became clear people were messing this up. Maybe they were blurting out the 3 divorces, not thinking, then regretting it later.
Like hitting undo on a major life decision and not realizing how much it could hurt, how messy it could get.
Exactly. And Umar, he was a smart, practical guy. He stepped in, he saw that marriage was important and people shouldn't be acting without thinking. So he made it a rule. Those 3 I divorce yous. That's 3 separate divorces. No going back.
Wow, that was a big change. He was really trying to make people understand that divorce is serious business.
It really shows you Islamic law isn't stuck in time. It changes to fit what's going on while still keeping its main values. Even though it comes from God, there's room for people to figure things out, to deal with new problems.
Now, this next thing, it's not directly about divorce, but I found it super interesting. When a husband swears an oath to say his wife is unlawful, it's about the power of words, right? And what you mean when you say them in a marriage.
Totally. Even if you don't actually say divorce, what you say can still have a huge impact on the marriage. If a husband says his wife is unlawful, even if he's not trying to divorce her, that's a serious oath. He needs to do something to fix it.
It's like saying those words puts up a wall, spiritually. And you can't just ignore it. You got to repent, ask God to forgive you.
And there's a story about the Prophet Muhammad himself. He loved honey. He used to visit his wives and, spend time with them. Well, once, after he had honey at the house of his wife, Zainab bint Jahsh, his other wife smelled it on his breath. They weren't happy. Maybe he felt pressured. Maybe he just wanted to keep everyone happy, but he swore he wouldn't have honey anymore.
It was a spur-of-the-moment thing, right? He was trying to handle a tricky situation, didn't want to upset anyone.
Exactly. But even though he meant well, it backfired. God later revealed to him that he shouldn't forbid something that was allowed. It shows us how important it is to think before we speak, especially about stuff in our marriage.
Yeah, even the best of us. We can make dumb decisions when we're stressed, and our words matter. especially when we're talking about something as sacred as marriage. We got to be careful with what we say, even if it seems like no big deal. It can have consequences we don't expect.
Speaking of words and their impact, another thing that comes up is this idea of giving a wife the option to divorce.
I know that might sound kind of weird at first,
Mm-hmm.
but as we've been talking about, Islamic law isn't always straightforward. So just giving a wife the choice to get a divorce, that doesn't mean they are divorced, right?
Nope. It's not like the husband is ordering it. He's giving her a choice. She gets to decide if she wants to stay or leave. It only counts as a divorce if she says she wants out.
It's about her having control. She gets to decide what happens to her life, even if she's married.
And the idea of giving this option, it's tied to a story about the Prophet Muhammad himself. Some of his wives, they wanted a fancier lifestyle. He felt pressure, so he gave them the choice. They could divorce him if they wanted. They had to choose, worldly comforts or stay with their husband and their faith.
Wow, that's a big decision. Even in a marriage considered to be, guided by God, there can be tough times.
And in the end, his wives, they chose to stay. They were more devoted to the Prophet and their spiritual journey than to fancy things.
That says a lot about them, right? Their strength, how deep their faith was.
Absolutely. And that story also shows us that open communication, understanding each other, that's important in a marriage. You got to talk about what you need, even if you disagree, and find a way forward that works for both of you. Speaking of figuring things out when there's disagreement, there's another idea in these hadiths. Ayla.
For anyone who doesn't know that word, ila is when the husband chooses not to be intimate with his wife for a while. It's not divorce, but it's a big deal. It's like saying, I'm not happy. Or maybe it's just creating space when you're fighting.
Yeah, it's a form of protest, a way to show you're really unhappy or to take a break from the physical side of marriage while you deal with the problems causing the fight.
And we know that the Prophet Muhammad himself did this, right?
Yeah.
There were disagreements with some of his wives about their lifestyle, money stuff. So he separated himself from them for a month.
It's in the hadiths. And it shows that even in a marriage like that, which we consider divinely guided, there were still problems. And Ila, it's serious, but it's not meant to end the marriage forever. It's more like a time to think and hopefully to come back together.
Like hitting pause on the physical stuff, to focus on fixing the emotional and practical things. Let things calm down. Maybe you understand each other better after.
It reminds us that even when marriage gets tough, there are ways to communicate, find solutions, and protect that bond.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the money side of divorce. We see the story of Fatima bin Qais. She was divorced, no going back. And she went to the Prophet Muhammad for advice. She wanted to know, does her ex-husband have to support her financially during her waiting period? This caused some debate among Islamic scholars later on.
It's interesting, right? It shows how Islamic law, even though it's based on what God said, there can be different ways to understand it, depending on the situation. In Fatima bin Qais' case, the Prophet said her ex didn't have to provide for her because the divorce was final.
At first, that seems like it goes against how Islam protects and supports women. How does that fit with the idea of justice and compassion?
It's important to remember Islamic law is more than just rules from God. People interpret them, and the context matters. Maybe in Fatima's case, the specific kind of divorce, her own situation, those things influence the Prophet's decision.
The fact that scholars debated it later on, that shows you Islamic law is alive. It changes to deal with complicated situations. It reminds us that even though there's guidance from God, we're still figuring things out.
And this case brings up another point. What about a divorced woman leaving the house during her iddah? We often hear she has to stay home, but the hadiths have more to say about that.
Yeah, it seems like women staying home during iddah wasn't supposed to be a strict no exceptions rule. There's a story about Jabir ibn Abdullah's aunt. Someone told her off for leaving to tend her date palms during her iddah.
But she asked the Prophet Muhammad about it, and he said it was okay for a woman to leave home during iddah if she needed to, like for important errands, for work, or to do good deeds.
So the idea is to protect the woman, make sure she has her privacy and dignity. But it also recognizes that she has real-life things to do, and as long as it's appropriate, she can still be part of things during this time.
It's not about locking her away. It's about balance. Being secluded, but also being able to live her life in a way that follows Islam.
And that balance, that idea of considering the context, it's all over Islamic teachings. There's the story of Subaya bint al-Harith. Her husband died when she was pregnant. She wasn't sure how long her iddah should be after the baby was born, so she asked the Prophet.
And in that case, he said that when the baby's born, the waiting period is over. No more wondering for her, and she was free to marry again if she wanted to.
So he recognized that giving birth is a big change, a new chapter in her life. He gave her the freedom to move forward.
And it shows that Islamic law can be sensitive and flexible. It adapts to individual situations.
Let's talk about something that's not always easy to discuss, but it's important. Islamic rules about mourning, especially mourning a husband.
The hadiths are clear about this. They stress the importance of remembering the dead with respect, but also acknowledging how hard it is to lose someone. You need time to grieve.
They say if you're mourning anyone other than your husband, it shouldn't be longer than 3 days. But for a husband, the mourning period is 4 months of 10 days.
Right. That longer time for a husband, it shows how special the bond between husband and wife is, and it gives the wife time to deal with all the changes, to heal.
And during that time, women shouldn't wear fancy things or perfume. It's a way to show they're grieving, to honor their husband.
It's a beautiful tradition, a way to show respect while also letting the wife focus on her feelings, on life without her husband.
It's all about understanding how deep human emotions are, how important marriage is, and honoring the relationships we build, even after death.
It's about recognizing how much loss hurts and creating a way to grieve that's respectful and caring.
Now, on to something a bit more sensitive and legally complex. Lion. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. Lying is what happens when a husband says his wife cheated on him, but he doesn't have the 4 witnesses you need to prove it in Islamic court. It's the last resort when you have a serious accusation but no real proof.
So it's a way to try to find some resolution to stop things from getting worse when nobody knows for sure what happened.
Exactly. With lying, both the husband and wife swear oaths. They're basically saying, if I'm lying, may God curse me. It's a very serious thing. It shows how big the accusation is and that lying to God is a huge deal.
It's like a big test. You're risking God's punishment if you're not telling the truth.
And if they go through with lions, they have to separate. The husband doesn't have to support his wife financially anymore. But even though there's this accusation and they separate, the children are still considered the mother's.
So the kids' rights are protected. No matter what happens with Lion, they're not punished because of something their parents might have done.
Exactly. And this is important in Islamic law, protecting innocent people, especially children.
We see this focus on fairness and proof in another hadith. The Prophet Muhammad wouldn't let a man disown his child just because the kid had dark skin. The man thought his wife must have cheated. But the Prophet was like, you need proof, not just assumptions.
It shows us that justice needs evidence. You can't just go around accusing people based on prejudice or what you think happened.
This idea of fairness is really clear in the hadiths about freeing slaves. It gives us insights into what Islam teaches about ethics and society.
Yeah, those hadiths really push for freeing slaves, especially if multiple people own them together, or if the slave has a contract to buy their freedom. It has to be done fairly, where both the slave and the owner are treated right.
It's not just randomly saying, you're free. It's a whole system done ethically so nobody gets hurt and the transition to freedom is as good as it can be.
Like, imagine if a slave has 2 owners and one wants to free them. They can't just do their half and leave it there. They either got to buy the other half so the slave is totally free, or they got to set up a fair work plan so the slave can earn enough to buy the rest of their freedom.
It's like saying you can't just partially free someone. You have to make sure they're actually free.
Exactly. And this fairness thing, it's important when we talk about inheritance after a slave is freed. There's the story of Baria. She was a slave who wanted to buy her freedom. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, wanted to help her, but Baria's owners had a condition. If Aisha paid for her freedom, then she would get any inheritance Baria might have later.
So Baria would be free physically, but her future, her money, would still be under someone else's control. It shows how even when you're freeing someone, there can still be exploitation.
But the Prophet Muhammad stepped in. He said the inheritance belongs to whoever grants freedom, not the other way around. He was against people making up rules that aren't in Islamic law.
He was saying that freedom needs to be real freedom, not just a way for someone else to get something out of it.
It really shows how the Prophet cared about protecting the weak and making sure Islamic law is used for justice and compassion.
It's about making sure people who have been slaves can live with dignity, and nobody's trying to control them or use them.
And this idea of protecting ex-slaves, it goes further than just money. The hadiths also say that a freed slave can't just choose a new patron without their old master's permission.
That might seem strange, but it makes sense when you think about how society worked back then. Even though someone was free, there were still connections and obligations to their old master.
This rule stopped misunderstandings, prevented people from being disloyal, and protected freed slaves from anyone trying to take advantage of them.
It was all about making that shift from slavery to freedom as easy and safe as possible.
And the main point about freeing slaves, it's this. It's not just a legal thing, it's an act of mercy. It shows you care about justice. And in Islam, it earns you huge rewards.
The Hadiths explain this in a beautiful way. Prophet Muhammad said that for every part of a slave's body you free, God frees a part of your body from hellfire.
That really paints a picture, doesn't it? It shows how important this act of freeing slaves is. It connects what we do in this life to what happens after we die. When you free a slave, you're not just setting them free physically, you're freeing yourself from being selfish and greedy. And God loves that.
That message really speaks to us. True freedom isn't just physical, it's spiritual too. Yeah. And the things we do, they have consequences that go way beyond what we can see.
It makes us think about our own lives. How can we show compassion, fight for what's right, and create a world where everyone is treated with dignity? It really does make you think. It's powerful how these hadiths about freeing slaves, even though they're from so long ago, they still teach us about being kind, being fair, and how our actions connect us all.
I agree. It shows how wise these teachings are. They can still inspire us today.
And going through these hadiths, it's like we're right there with those early Muslims. They were dealing with tough stuff, trying to live by the Prophet's teachings every day.
It's like we're part of their journey, figuring out how Islamic thought works, how they built a fair and caring society.
And speaking of figuring things out, one thing that pops up a lot in Book 9 is how Islamic law changes. It's not just a bunch of rules set in stone. It's a living thing. It adapts to what people need while sticking to its core values.
Yeah, that's so clear with the whole triple talaq thing. At first, it was like one divorce you could take back, but then Caliph Umar changed that.
Umar saw that people were taking advantage of that leniency. He knew you need to balance forgiveness and reconciliation with protecting marriage.
It makes you wonder, what was happening back then? What made Umar make that change?
It's hard to know for sure from just the hadiths, but we can guess. Maybe he saw too many divorces happening too fast without thinking, women and children left with nothing.
Or maybe some men were using it to control their wives, just saying, I divorce you 3 times to scare them. That would make families so unstable.
Definitely possible. Umar was a smart leader. He saw those problems. He had to protect marriage, the whole Muslim community.
It's a perfect example of how Islamic law comes from God, but it also has to work in the real world. It has to change sometimes to do what's right.
And that ability to change, to deal with new problems while staying true to its values, that's why Islamic law still matters today. It's a living tradition.
Totally. It shows how wise it is and how it can help us create a society that's fair, compassionate, and where everyone gets along.
And going back to wisdom, Book 9 also talks about how important your intentions are, especially when it comes to marriage. That story about Prophet Muhammad and the honey oath, it's a great example. Even little things you say can have big, unexpected results.
It shows how careful Islam is about how we treat each other, especially in marriage.
Right. Remember, the Prophet swore off honey because some of his wives complained about the smell. He wasn't trying to be mean.
He was just trying to keep the peace.
Exactly. But even with good intentions, he ended up making something that was okay into something forbidden. God had to remind him that you shouldn't just make things haram for no reason.
So think before you speak, right? Even if it seems small, especially in marriage. What we say has power. We can hurt people, even when we don't mean to.
And it's not just about what we say, but the choices we make in marriage. Like giving your wife the option to divorce. That shows how Islam respects a woman's right to choose.
We talked about that. Just offering the choice doesn't end the marriage. It's about giving her the power to decide if she wants to stay or not.
It's recognizing she has the right to control her own life, even in a marriage. And a powerful example of this is when the Prophet Muhammad himself offered this option to his wives.
It was a huge test. They had to decide between a comfortable life and their commitment to the Prophet and their faith.
They chose to stay, even though things were tough. That shows you how strong they were, how much they understood, and how deep their bond was.
It's inspiring. Their faith and resilience, choosing something bigger than themselves.
And that story teaches us something important. Communication is key. You have to understand each other, talk things out, even when it's hard, and you have to respect what each person wants and needs. And when things get tough, there's Ela. Remember, when the husband stops being intimate with his wife for a while...
It's like taking a break. Time to cool off and really look at what's causing the problems.
It's a way to show how unhappy you are without ending the marriage. The Prophet Muhammad did it himself when he had problems with some of his wives.
It shows that even in the best marriages, there will be fights. And Ila, it's a way to handle things, maybe even come back stronger.
It's a reminder to be patient, talk to each other, and work through those tough times. Protecting the marriage is important.
That idea of working things out, fixing relationships, it's all over Islam.
Let's talk about the money side of divorce again. Remember, Fatima bint Qais, her husband divorced her, and she asked the Prophet if he still had to support her. That case really got the scholars talking.
The Prophet said no, he doesn't have to support her because it was a final divorce. That's tricky, right? Islam's all about taking care of women, so how does that fit?
Islamic law takes a lot of things into account. The kind of divorce, her situation, those things mattered.
It shows that there are different opinions, even among the most knowledgeable people. We're all still learning.
It also reminds us that Islamic law is alive. It has to change with the times while still keeping its main values of justice and compassion.
And that brings us to another question. Can a divorced woman leave the house during Iddah? We always hear she can't, but is that true?
The Hadiths show it's not that simple. It's about finding a balance. Protecting her, but also letting her live her life.
Like Jabir ibn Abdullah's aunt, tending her date palms. People gave her a hard time, but the Prophet said it was fine.
Exactly. It's not about locking her up. It's about giving her space, letting her do what she needs to do.
That balance is important. And then there's Subaya bint al-Harith. Her husband died when she was pregnant. When did her Iddah end?
The Prophet said it ended when she gave birth. It shows how flexible Islamic law can be. It understands that life throws curveballs.
It's a kind and practical approach.
And this understanding, this compassion, it's in all the hadiths, like the rules about mourning. They give us a way to grieve, to honor the dead, but they also get that losing someone is really hard. You need time.
A longer mourning time for a husband shows how strong that bond is.
It gives her the space to deal with the loss, to move on at her own pace.
It shows how much Islam cares about people's feelings.
And that compassion even extends to really tough situations, like when a husband accuses his wife of adultery but he can't prove it. That's where lying comes in.
It's a last resort, but it's there to deal with these serious accusations.
They both swear oaths, asking God to curse them if they're lying. That's serious business.
It makes people think twice before they make false accusations.
And even though lying means they separate, the children still belong to the mother.
That's so important. It protects the kids from being punished for something they didn't do.
Islam is all about justice and protecting those who can't protect themselves.
And we see that in how the Prophet Muhammad wouldn't let that man disown his child just because the child had dark skin. He said, get some proof first.
It's about being fair, not judging people based on what you assume.
And then there's the whole topic of freeing slaves. It's a big one, showing us what Islam teaches about ethics and society.
Those hadiths really push for freedom, especially for slaves owned by multiple people or those with contracts to buy their freedom. It's not just about setting them free, it's about doing it right.
Like you were saying before, you can't just free your part of a slave and leave him hanging. You got to finish the job.
Exactly. And when it comes to inheritance, it's the same. Aisha wanted to buy Barir's freedom, but her owners tried to pull a fast one.
They wanted to get her inheritance, even though they were letting her go. That's messed up.
The Prophet stepped in and shut that down. He said the inheritance goes to the one who sets the slave free, not the other way around.
He was all about real freedom, not just a way to take advantage of someone.
He was protecting the vulnerable, making sure that freedom was genuine and complete.
And it's not just about inheritance. Freed slaves couldn't just pick a new protector without their old masters okay.
That's because even after being freed, there were still connections to the past. It protected them from being used.
It's about making that transition to freedom smooth and safe.
And freeing a slave, it's more than a legal thing. It's an act of mercy. It shows you care about justice. And in Islam, it's a big deal spiritually.
Esodidis explained that so beautifully. Free a part of a slave, God frees a part of you from hell. Wow.
It connects what we do here to what happens after we die. Freeing someone is about more than just their physical freedom. It's about freeing ourselves from selfishness. God sees that.
That's a message for all of us, no matter what time we live in. True freedom is deeper than just the physical stuff. And what we do matters. It affects other people, and it affects our souls.
It's a call to action, to be kind, to fight for what's right, and to make sure everyone is treated with dignity. It really is a powerful message. It's like Islam is saying, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. True faith is about more than just praying and fasting. It's about living a life that shows you care about justice, mercy, and treating everyone with dignity.
It's about getting that everything's connected, that even small acts of kindness, they can make a difference. They can ripple out and help build a world where everyone is treated fairly and with compassion.
You know, as we've been going through these hadiths, what's really struck me is how they connect what happens in our personal lives to what happens in society as a whole. They show how individual choices, how we act, it all adds up to create the kind of community we live in.
It's like seeing the foundation of a just society being built, brick by brick. Every rule, every ethical point, every story, it's all part of this bigger picture of how to live a good life, a life that's in harmony with ourselves, with each other, and with God.
And one of the most powerful examples of this is the story of Abdullah ibn Umar and his divorce. It's like a window into how divorce worked in those early days of Islam.
His story, the way he struggled with those rules, it helps us understand how Islamic law was actually used in real life.
Remember, Abdullah ibn Umar divorced his wife while she was on her period. He didn't know, or maybe he just messed up. But either way, he went against the rules in the hadiths, and the Prophet Muhammad told him to take his wife back.
It shows us that even the Prophet's closest companions, they made mistakes. And it highlights the importance of really understanding Islamic law. It's not always easy, is it?
But what's amazing is that Abdullah ibn Umar didn't just shrug it off. He admitted he was wrong, he asked for guidance, and he fixed it. He really cared about doing what was right, following the principles of Islam.
It's a good reminder for all of us. We're always learning. We're going to mess up sometimes, but we can always get back on track. Ask for forgiveness. Try harder next time.
And Abdullah ibn Umar's story also shows us how our understanding of Islamic law has changed over time. At first, saying, "I divorce you" 3 times all at once was like one divorce. But then Umar, Abdullah's dad, he changed the rule. It became 3 separate divorces.
Umar saw that people were abusing the old rule. He was wise enough to realize that change was needed to protect families and the community.
It's a great example of how Islamic law can adapt. It has its roots in God's word, but it can change to fit the needs of the people while still keeping its core values.
And that's why it's still relevant today, because it can adapt and evolve. It's not stuck in the past.
Exactly. The scholars and leaders back then, they understood that the spirit of the law is what matters most. It's about finding justice, showing compassion, and building a society where people can live together peacefully.
Speaking of justice and compassion, those themes are everywhere in the hadiths we've been discussing. They're woven into everything. Protecting women during their periods and waiting periods, making sure there's real evidence before accusing someone of adultery. They show how much Islam cares about everyone, especially those who are vulnerable.
The way these issues are dealt with, it's so thoughtful and nuanced. Like the rules about a divorced woman leaving her house during her iddah. At first it seems strict, but it's more about finding balance.
Yeah, Jabir ibn Abdullah's aunt and the date palms. She needed to tend to her trees. It shows that iddah isn't about locking women away.
It's about finding that middle ground, protecting her, but also understanding that she has a life to live.
And then there's Subaya bint al-Hurith. Her waiting period ended when her baby was born. Islamic law is flexible. It understands that life is full of surprises.
Right. It's a practical and merciful approach.
And that compassion, that understanding of what it means to be human, it's in all the hadiths. Even to the rules about mourning. They give us a way to grieve, to honor the people we've lost. But they also acknowledge that loss hurts. We need time to heal.
A longer mourning period for a husband, it just shows how deeply losing a spouse affects you.
It gives her the time and space she needs to process everything.
And this understanding, it's there even in the most difficult situations. Like when a husband accuses his wife of adultery, but he can't prove it, that's where lion comes in.
It's the last resort, but it's a way to deal with those serious accusations.
They both swear under oath, putting themselves at risk of God's punishment if they lie. It's a strong message about being truthful.
And even though lion means the couple separates, their children are still protected. They're still considered the mother's children.
That's so important. It's about protecting innocent people, especially children, no matter what's going on between the parents.
It goes back to what we were talking about before. Justice and compassion, those are the guiding principles.
Remember the Prophet Muhammad stopping that man from disowning his child just because the child had dark skin? That's another example.
He was basically saying, don't jump to conclusions, get the facts straight first.
It's about being fair, not letting prejudice or assumptions cloud your judgment.
And we see that same commitment to justice in the hadiths about freeing slaves. It's not just about saying you're free, it's about making sure it's done the right way.
It's about creating a system that protects everyone involved, both the slave and the owner.
Like we discussed, If you own part of a slave and want to free them, you can't just stop there. You got to make sure they're actually free.
Absolutely. You have to see it through. And the story of Abrea, that shows how even when people are trying to do something good, like free a slave, they can still be tempted to take advantage.
They wanted to keep control of her inheritance, even after letting her go.
But the prophet wouldn't allow it. He said freedom is about giving someone their full rights, their full dignity. It can't be conditional.
And that idea of protecting freed slaves, it's not just about money. They couldn't just go off and choose a new patron without their old master's permission.
It might seem strange to us now, but it was about protecting them from being used or exploited. It was about making that transition to freedom as smooth and safe as possible.
It's all connected, isn't it? The rules about divorce, mourning, adultery, freeing slaves, they're all part of this bigger picture of building a just and compassionate society.
They are, and what's really amazing is how they're still relevant today. They teach us about ethics, about social responsibility, about how to treat each other. They remind us that every action we take, it matters, it has consequences, both in this world and the next.
It's been a fascinating journey through Sahih Muslim Book 9, a real deep dive into the complexities of divorce and so much more. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you'll continue to explore these hadiths, to ponder their meanings, and to see how they can shed light on your own life and your understanding of the world around you.
Until next time, may your quest for knowledge be blessed, and may your hearts be filled with compassion and an unwavering commitment to justice.
Peace and blessings be upon you all.